Toki Kage desu ka? Watanabe-dan desu. On this 4th of July, we're going to be taking a look at 3 movies that exemplify the holiday. The first of them is a very patriotic film, 1942's Yankee Doodle Dandy, starring James Cagney playing George M. Cohan. Like most biographies, Yankee Doodle Dandy has very scant relationship to the truth. In real life, George M. Cohan was known as being a rather unpleasant gentleman. But under James Cagney's performance, he comes across as someone who is innately lovable, eternally charismatic, and overall just a lot of fun. And so it is thus perhaps the best of these movies to take a look at on the 4th of July itself. You will be absolutely inspired by his rendition of Yankee Doodle Dandy and by Mary Mary and all the other songs that George M. Cohan was very famous for. And of course, there is that humorous moment when some teenagers come by and look at him as an old altacocker and show him what really works now in terms of music, which is the song Jeepers Creepers. So Cagney himself is the force of nature that makes this film still wonderful today, and it reminds us of how versatile he was as a performer. After all, most of us think of him in his gangster roles or as one of those crackerjack producers in a movie like Footlight Parade, or in his incarnation as the America-loving Coca-Cola executive faced with the prospect of his ward, the daughter of the president of Coca-Cola, falling in love with a communist in the Berlin of the new wall coming up. What's interesting about the way Cohen is presented is, again, that he is presented sympathetically. And this caused me to reflect on other movies that I had previously condemned for their inaccuracies, particularly Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which in a discussion that I had yesterday with some of my compatriots, they once again were regaling about how wonderful they feel the film is. But I've always had a problem with it because of the way it treated the Manson murders at the very end. That giving that crime a happy ending is something that, because I had studied the Manson case so thoroughly, used to bother me a great deal, to the point where I said, I can't like this movie because it is so irresponsible. But they reminded me it's called Once Upon a Time. And not only that, but what Hollywood biography or vision of history is ever truly accurate? Certainly, Dr. Zhivago doesn't really give us insight into the Russian Revolution, and Gandhi is a total whitewash job. So going hand in hand with something like Yankee Doodle Dandy, I can't say that I like one movie and then condemn another one for the same thing. That's just me being inconsistent. So I will be reevaluating what I thought about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And again, just like Funny Girl completely ignored the fact that Fanny Brice had had another husband before she met Nick Arnstein, we'll just have to take um, we'll just have to take Yankee Doodle Dandy as one of those fictions about somebody's life that allows us to enjoy what they created rather than focus on their perhaps less than stellar past. The next movie is one that's not about the 4th of July specifically, but is about patriotism in general and some of the challenges that face patriotism as with its consequences. And that movie is 1946's Best Years of Our Lives. Now, time has been fairly kind to this movie, but not 100%. There's certain elements of this Academy Award winner for Best Picture, Actor, I believe supporting actress, an actor, and director and writer. But one of the problems with it when we watch it today is its length. On the other hand, if we're willing to sit with it and accept its admittedly now rather soft pedaled, but still, when you consider this was made just a year after the war ended, it was a brave statement. It was Hollywood acknowledging that many of the people who had just gotten done saving the world for democracy, came back to a world that was still riddled with problems. Chief among them is Frederick March, who plays someone who has missed his children growing up and now finds a precursor to the generation gap facing him. And in the process of that, he finds himself a little bit alienated. Moreover, he finds that people who had stayed behind have now advanced beyond him in the workplace. And he gives over, at least momentarily, to bouts of alcoholism. But the most challenging of the characters in terms of having to adapt is Harold Russell, who plays someone who left and with patriotic fervor, but came back missing his hands. Harold Russell would, in fact, win Best Supporting Actor for this role because he was someone who had been through that. And while the movie gives him a happy ending and allows him to reintegrate into society, there is a slight piece of us who realize that, like in many of the other films that would feature increasingly people who suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, as we would now call it, and other ailments, such as in Pride of the Marines, where the soldier comes back blind, that it's not always a smooth reintegration. What's also interesting is that the movie presents the third of the characters, who's played by Dana Andrews, as someone who achieved great glory during the war despite his working class background. And he comes home to realize that that glory he had achieved during the war is gone. His wife is having an affair on him. He cannot land a proper job. He's just not able to reintegrate. Now, because this was just at the beginning of the film noir period, the film doesn't go too deeply into those bas-fonds. Instead, it allows him a happy ending, ironically, with Frederick March's daughter. So it all kind of comes together in a very nice way. What I appreciate the most about the movie is it shows what a great director Wyler was, because he alternates between filmmaking styles with each of his three stories, allowing the Frederick March one to be one where you discover what you need to see, such as the famous scene where he returns from the war, done in deep focus. Now, Wyler and Greg Toland were the pioneers of this style and had done it a lot in the 1930s and early 40s, including in movies such as Dodsworth and The Letter. And I consider it an historic problem that Orson Welles is continually credited with having pioneered it when it was clearly in use before that. And Wyler, I sense, was getting a little bit of his revenge during the Frederick March scenes because they indeed use deep focus almost continually. The Harold Russell scenes are kind of typically Hollywood schmaltz. So they are far more intimate with their close-ups, which I gotta hand to Harold Russell is one of the toughest things for an actor to do, much less one who is coming at this as an amateur. But that stuff comes across. With the Dana Andrews scenes, we get the very beginnings of a film noir sense where the setting is darker, where we feel claustrophobic and trapped, even in bright spaces, such as when Dana Andrews is forced to become a soda jerk at a drugstore, and he finds himself confronted by someone who questions the very validity of the war itself. And they get into a fight and he loses his job. This is nonetheless a scene that is harrowing because of the way it is shot and the precursor for Dana Andrews's later work, such as on Where the Sidewalk Ends. We get the sense to see the beginning of his truly great film persona blossoming. The third is one that I consider to be very interesting for a host of completely outside the norm reasons, and that is Born on the 4th of July. And you might think that this Tom Cruise starring vehicle that was directed and written by Oliver Stone is anything but patriotic. But I'm going to disagree with you on that, because Stone, in spite of himself, especially during this stage of his career, despite his verbalization of anti-Americanism and pro-leftism and all the rest, nonetheless always followed a Horatio Alger type story arc. And Born on the 4th of July is, if nothing else, the ultimate Douglas Sirk movie that for some reason has Tom Cruise in it instead of Rock Hudson, where he is put through the paces, more melodramatic than anyone since Joan Crawford in Straight Jacket, where he is entitled to some of the biggest emotions that we have seen coming from a male actor, and often supported by almost ludicrous musical cues and production design, such as at the beginning when he's working in the local grocery store, and on the soundtrack we hear "Oh My Little Soldier Boy" playing on the soundtrack before he goes out there. But these are juxtaposed with him behaving in the best Joan Crawford manner when he is actually brought down by becoming a paraplegic. In the scenes where he is struggling against that, we are entirely on his side. And look at how that movie ends. At the very end, we've seen Ron Kovic, who has been a victim of the system, who has been brutalized, who gets into this incredible scenery chewing scene worthy of Patty Duke at the end of Valley of the Dolls, yelling at his mother about how all he wants to do is have his dick back and be able to fuck. And it's an impressively melodramatic scene, only topped by a wheelchair battle between he and Willem Dafoe. And so any movie that has this kind of colorfulness in it, this kind of outre production design, this kind of over-the-top melodramatics, fully in the same key as Mommy Dearest, how is it possible not to love that? And at the very end, even though they don't say where Ron Kovic is, because certainly they say, oh, well, you know, he's in support of Jimmy Carter, everyone would say, oh, come on, man. Instead, at the end, we see him achieving triumph. He has achieved something that had he come back whole, he never would have been able to. It is the American success story writ large. So if there's anything that's a common theme between these three films, it's about the grit of the American personality type, that grit that doesn't let anybody say, I will be satisfied with enough, or I will be satisfied with that little pat on the head. So even though all three come from a slightly different perspective on patriotism, they hold up really well and remind us of especially why on an American holiday that we have every reason in the world to love the movies.
I'm singing in the rain, just singing in the rain.